in some drafts, you get that quarterback prospect that the thought of what they could be, the physical tools excite you. The risks are obvious. Get the traditional boom or bust prospect label. And we've certainly seen that out of guys over the years, whether it be the Achilles Smiths of the world, Jamarcus Russell, Cam Newton. Like, those are some guys that you looked at when people were talking about physical tool sets, physical talents, and the thought about what they could be, was very enticing and led to those quarterbacks being selected incredibly high in the NFL draft. And obviously, to some mixed results, right? And this year's candidate that falls into that bucket is Anthony Richardson from Florida. Because certainly, from a sheer physical tools and physical talent standpoint, he stands alone in this year's draft class. Period. No other quarterback prospect in this year's draft class has his combination of size, arm strength, athleticism, arm talent. Nobody. Argue with a wall. But that alone does not make a great quarterback or a great quarterback prospect. And I will confess, as I was studying Anthony Richardson, I was torn. Because I'm sure there are a number of you that were probably assuming that I'm going to say that Anthony Richardson was my QB1, like you feel like it's destiny waiting to happen. But then I think about, hey, some of these guys with the great physical tools, like Trey Lance so far certainly hasn't worked out for the 49ers. Zach Wilson certainly hasn't worked out for the New York Jets. Like, it's an example of me trying to learn from the lessons of the past, but also saying, hey, on the flip side, I was really high on Cam back in 2011 and was validated there. I was really high on Josh Allen in 2018, Lamar Jackson as well, frankly, and feel pretty validated with those too. So it's like, you don't want to ignore mistakes, but you don't want to totally sweep previous successes under the rug. You have to learn from both. And that's the internal conflict or struggle I have with evaluating Anthony Richardson, because from a strength standpoint, he's built like a freaking house. He's got the height you'd prefer at the position, being 6'4". He's over 240 pounds. He's damn near like Dante Culpepper type of size when Culpepper was coming out of Central Florida. He's got a rocket launcher for a right arm. He can fire that pill all over the field easily, relatively easily. He's got the strongest arm in this year's draft class. Again, argue with the wall if you think he doesn't. He does. He's also got the ability to escape the pocket quickly, extend plays with his feet, but he's also a legit home run threat with his feet. So when you think about the modern NFL game and you want guys with size, arm strength, athleticism, he's got that in abundance. He absolutely does. But he's not just that as a prospect. If you only focus on that, you're missing the bigger picture. He showed a really good awareness at Florida this year of knowing when to throw the ball away. He showed, more advanced mental instincts for the position in the game than you might expect from a guy that only had one full season as a starter. He showed some ability to go through his progressions and make the right read. He can hit downfield throws with decent timing and ball placement. He's able to move it within the pocket, keeping his eyes downfield. Some guys can be great in terms of escaping pressure, getting out of the pocket, but at that point, then they just become a runner. He can still be a passer when he's scrambling, when he's avoiding the rush. He also flashed some nice ability at times throughout the year to hit the soft spot out deep and outside in the cover two. That's nice. Like, that's the type of throw you want to be able to see a quarterback make, because you're going to need to be able to make that at the NFL level. So it wasn't just the size, the arm strength, the athleticism, the running ability that made me say, wow, when it came to Anthony Richardson. That said, there are certainly a lot of things that will give you some pause here. First is that he's basically a one-speed thrower. Like, he throws everything really hard. Like, he's trying to pound that shit in. like I was a 20-year-old on Serena Williams' vagina. He's making every throw like he's just trying to nut and put a baby in it. You get the reference now? And what happens is that leads to balls bouncing all over the place. And I know you're going to say, well, that's inappropriate. Yes, it is. But a number of throws will bounce off of the receiver's hands because he's trying to rocket launch everything in there. And sometimes that's just not required. His accuracy and ball placement is hit or miss. He misses a number of very basic throws, and some of that, again, is just trying to throw the shit out of the pill every single time. Sometimes, this is kind of the catch-22 with these really athletic quarterback talents, these quarterback prospects, is they can be too quick to bail out of the pocket at times when they get even a little bit of pressure, whereas it might be better for you to be able to step up and move within the pocket and still keep the integrity of the pocket there and keep the play in that sense. But, that's something you have to live with sometimes. He does have a bit of a wind-up and elongated throwing motion, similar to like Dante Culpepper used to have, similar to what Cam Newton had. The difference is, though, is that with that slightly elongated delivery and throwing motion, you've got so much velocity that it can somewhat compensate for it. However, it does beg a concern, similar to a guy like a Cam Newton, is if you end up having shoulder surgery or shoulder problems, you lose some of that zip. Now you've just got a really long throwing motion, and it could generate some problems. He does take some sacks that he could avoid when he's trying to make the big play instead of taking the safer, maybe keep it moving type of play. Also showed some instances of making the more difficult throw where the easier one would have worked just fine. But again, that's another catch-22, right? That could be a matter of perspective and opinion. Sometimes you'll see the short crosser breaking, you say, hey, just throw it there, but he'll throw it to the deeper crosser that's into a tighter window. But because of his arm talent, he can make that throw. You wonder if that will jump up and bite him a little bit in the NFL, but he can make that throw, so sometimes that might be okay. There's also a big concern here because you're talking about a guy that ultimately has limited experience. He only has 1 full year as a starter. So you sit there and you like to have your quarterback prospects have more experience as a starter. It's a very mixed bag with a lot of negatives in terms of guys that only started 1 year at the college level and how successful they could be at the NFL level. But Cam Newton ultimately made that work, so it's not impossible. But a legitimate concern nonetheless. When I look at Richardson, there are some red flags and there's some real cautionary things. Like, if you've got people that are saying he's not a first-round talent, he's not even one of my top 4 QBs in this draft, frankly, I understand that. And I'm not going to pound the table as much as maybe I would in the past, and maybe that's a problem, right? But I get it, because Richardson is absolutely the highest boom-bust prospect in this year's quarterback class, even much more than Levis. Because Levis certainly has high upside, and he has a pretty low floor, but I think you have an even bigger range, a bigger variance of what you could see out of Richardson. Richardson's ceiling is by far higher than any other quarterback in this draft class, but his floor is also lower by a good bit than any of the other top quarterbacks in this class. But in today's game, a guy with Richardson's size, arm strength, athleticism can succeed. Whether his upside is ultimately realized depends on the system and the coaching that he lands with and lands under. When I look at him, I see teams like the Colts and being able to work under Shane Steichen, who was the offensive coordinator for a couple of years in Philly, that worked with Jalen Hurts. That would be a really good situation for him. Being able to go somewhere like in Detroit and getting to work with Johnson in that offense and being under Dan Campbell, a really good place for him to be. So the system's going to be important. You could also argue maybe Carolina at number 1, and maybe some Panthers fans are having a conniption that I'm suggesting it. Hey, but if I'm the Panthers right now, the decision is between C.J. Stroud and Anthony Richardson. Those are the 2 guys you got to consider. Do you want the best pocket passer in this class, which is C.J. Stroud? Or do you want to swing for the fences, especially knowing that you're lacking some premium picks in the next couple of drafts? Do you want to swing for the fences and go for the guy with the highest upside in Richardson? That's the decision that has to be made. There's very high risk and bust potential here, but what if he does reach it? And it stands to reason to me, even with the limited experience, that this is a guy that can grow and he can get better. If you say, man, his completion percentage stunk in 2022 at Florida. Yeah, it's not like every single one of those throws was inaccurate. A number of them bounced off a receiver's hands because he threw the ball too damn hard. Who else used to do that? Josh Allen. So when I look at NFL comparisons, I see elements of Josh Allen in his game. I see Cam Newton in his game. I see some Dante Culpepper in his game. I look at, maybe some Trey Lance too. But the comparison that feels the closest or most appropriate here is Cam Newton. And I'm a buyer on the Anthony Richardson draft stock. I really am. I think he's a top 5 talent in this draft. He is right there with C.J. Stroud in terms of QB1, QB2. That upside is so tantalizing. And if he comes close to realizing it, he will be the best quarterback out of this year's draft class. Or we will be laughing about in 3 years just how people like me were so high on him and he was a total complete washout and we should have been able to see the warning signs. And those warning signs are absolutely there. But if you're going to pay attention to the warning signs, you got to look at the upside and potential here because it is massive.